I was recently at a dinner with an urban planner, and he had spent the better part of a decade trying to get a single bike lane approved in a major American city. He was, incredibly proud. He was showing me these community engagement logs, stacks of environmental impact statements. I mean, literally thousands of pages of what he called due process. He spoke about these documents with the reverence of a monk describing a holy relic. To him, the fact that they'd spent 10 years just talking about it, that was the victory. The process was the product. But then the conversation shifted. Someone at the table pulled up a video on their phone, a first-person view from the cockpit of the new Jakarta-Bandung high-speed train. We watched as the speedometer hit 350 kilometers per hour, the Indonesian landscape just blurring into this streak of vibrant green and sleek gray. The planner's face, it didn't light up with professional interest. Instead, it just clouded over with this strange, almost defensive agitation. But where's the consensus, he muttered, almost to himself. How many stakeholders were ignored to pour that much concrete so fast? And that reaction was a revelation for me. He was staring at a miracle of modern engineering, yet all he could see was a moral failure because it hadn't been strangled by a decade of committee meetings. It made me realize that we are currently witnessing a profound civilizational divorce. On one side, you have the Vetocracy, a system where everyone has the power to say no, and where, governance workshops and democratic consultations have become the primary export. On the other side, you have the order of concrete. It's this model emerging from East Asia that treats efficiency as the supreme form of justice. To these nations, a high-speed rail line isn't just a transport link. It's a physical projection of state will. It's the ultimate stress test of whether a society still has the capacity to shape its own future. While one world is busy filing reports, the other is busy reshaping the earth. And that tension, that clash between process and product, between the power to veto and the power to build, that is, I think, structurally the most important geopolitical story of our time. We have a mountain of material here that really defines the two sides of this divide, and we're going to unpack the mechanisms behind both. Okay, so let's start with the West, because the critique of this institutional paralysis in the United States is backed up by some truly shocking data. We have to begin with the paradox, right? How can the wealthiest nation on earth be so uniquely bad at building things?
It really is the great American infrastructure paradox, and it's a stunning indicator of a deep structural failure. When you look at the United States, a country with, unmatched financial resources, it consistently ranks near the bottom among wealthy nations for efficiently delivering major infrastructure.
And that inefficiency, it's a fundamental drag on everything. Economic mobility, quality of life.
Everything. And the data, as you said, isn't just a slight variation. It's not like we're 10% more expensive.
It's an order of magnitude difference.
Right.
We're looking at studies comparing the cost of building just 1 kilometer of heavy rail in the U.S. versus peer nations.
Germany, Japan.
Germany, Sweden, Japan, Spain. The list goes on. And the American cost is typically 2 to 3 times higher.
Wow.
Think about what that means in real terms. You're spending $2, maybe $3 billion to achieve the same kilometer of transit that a major European economy can deliver for $1 billion.
And you've seen this extend beyond rail, right? It's not just a train problem. Oh, absolutely not. It extends to highways, to utility upgrades, to airport modernizations, virtually all critical infrastructure development right across the board.
So what's the history here? Because it wasn't always like this. You think about the interstate highway system, the Hoover Dam, the TVA, things got built.
Exactly. You're pointing to the big shift. The U.S. once operated under a model of what you could call muscular state-led development.
The New Deal era.
The New Deal era is the perfect example.
Yeah.
Federal agencies had the political mandate and, crucially, the bureaucratic capacity to execute these massive projects quickly and, relatively cheaply.
That system has it's withered away.
It's withered and been systematically replaced by what we're calling the vetocracy.
Yeah.
It's a system that's almost perfectly designed to distribute veto power as broadly as possible.
So you give everyone a red button.
Everyone gets a red button. Multiple agencies, stakeholders, community groups, private citizens, which essentially guarantees paralysis.
So if the New Deal state was a bulldozer, the vetocracy is a gridlocked intersection with 1,000 stop signs.
A very good analogy.
How does this veto power actually manifest? What are the key mechanisms that make everything so paralyzingly expensive?
The single most potent mechanism is probably what we can call the environmental review trap. And this is anchored by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA.
Right, NEPA. Now, the original intent was good, I assume.
The original intent was perfectly sound to ensure that major projects actually considered their environmental impacts, but over decades, it has. Well, it's metastasized. It's now the primary legal choke point for almost every major project in the country.
So it went from being a shield for the environment to a sword for obstruction. How does a group, say an opposition group, actually use NEPA to stop a multi-billion-dollar project?
They exploit the procedural requirements. It's all about process. NEPA mandates these incredibly extensive environmental impact statements and EIS.
The documents the planner was so proud of.
Precisely. These studies can take years to complete, cost tens of millions of dollars, and they have to address every conceivable environmental impact.
And you mean every impact?
I mean, from noise pollution on a remote wetland to, and we've seen this in real cases, the potential shadows that might be cast by a new bridge on a particular garden.
That's incredible. So once that 1,000-page document is submitted, the legal trap is sprung.
Exactly. See, the U.S. system lacks a single central bureaucracy that can give a final, unassailable yes. So regulatory compliance gets outsourced to the adversarial court system.
Which means anyone can sue.
Any determined opposition group, a local neighborhood association, an environmental NGO, even a business competitor can hire a lawyer, find one procedural loophole in those thousands of pages, and file a lawsuit.
And that lawsuit immediately just stops the bulldozers.
It triggers an injunction. The project is instantly halted, often for months, sometimes for years, while the court determines if the agency followed every single step of the procedure perfectly.
And the court doesn't care if the project is a vital new subway line for millions of people.
The court's job isn't to weigh the public interest or economic efficiency. Its job is to rule on legal process. It operates on its own timeline, which has no connection to a construction schedule.
Can you give us another concrete example of how this plays out? Some of them are just, they sound absurd.
They often are. There are cases where entire projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, have been held up for years of new studies over the potential disturbance to the habitat of a non-endangered but protected species.
Okay.
Or a lawsuit trying to stop construction over concerns that a new highway might affect the hydrology of a nearby private garden.
Yep.
The outcome is always the same.
Delay.
Massive delay. The costs balloon and all the momentum just dies.
This must create an absolutely impossible incentive structure for the government officials who are actually supposed to be building things.
It's the core systemic flaw. You said it earlier. They're incentivized to do nothing.
Right.
Government entities have enormous incentives to move slowly, to be excessively cautious, and to avoid any decision, no matter how beneficial, that might trigger litigation. The penalty for being slow is basically zero.
But the penalty for trying to be bold and getting sued is
a decade of legal hell and a professional black mark. So they're forced into systematic delay. That paralysis becomes baked right into the cost structure of everything.
So the high cost isn't really the steel or the concrete, it's the cost of time and legal risk.
Precisely. And we can trace how that delay translates directly into dollars and cents. Just look at labor costs.
Okay.
On major infrastructure projects in the U.S., labor now makes up a huge proportion of the total cost. We're talking in the range of 40 to 60%.
40 to 60. Wait, what is it in those peer nations we mentioned?
In places like Germany or Japan, labor is typically 19 to 30% of the cost.
So it's double. Is that just because American wages are so much higher, or is it something else?
It's not the wages themselves. It's the cost of inconsistency. Think about it. If you have a construction sector that is constantly at risk of injunctions and multi-year delays,
you can't keep people working steadily.
Right. Specialized contractors and highly skilled union labor, they can't rely on consistent work. So they have to charge a massive risk premium when work is authorized because they know the project might just stop next week for 2 years.
So you're essentially paying engineers and specialized crews to sit idle, or you're paying a huge premium to reassemble them every time an injunction is lifted.
Yes. The inefficiency of the legal system directly inflates the wage bill, and it discourages investment.
Right.
Why would you invest in a massive, expensive tunnel boring machine if you know it's going to sit dormant in a field for 3 years waiting for a judge?
It creates a structural doom loop.
It's a perfect term for it. And then you add procurement failures to the mix.
How does that work?
The standard practice in the U.S. incentivizes contractors to submit an initially low bid just to win the contract.
Knowing it's not realistic.
knowing full well that the legal and procedural hurdles guarantee delays. And once those delays hit caused by the very veto points we've been discussing, the contractor then extracts enormous additional funds through change orders and litigation.
So the cost overruns aren't a surprise. They're a predictable, even guaranteed feature of the system. It's a built-in risk premium.
Absolutely. And the really tragic outcome of all this is that the entire development paradigm becomes biased toward tiny incremental projects, patching up the old instead of building the new.
And the ultimate symbol of this is
the California High-Speed Rail Project. A plan that was supposed to revolutionize connectivity in the state now stands as this cautionary global symbol of how debate can substitute for action.
how a wealthy modern state can completely seize up under the weight of its own processes.
The system actively grinds itself to a halt.
Okay, so that is the Western side. High process, high cost, low output. Now let's turn the globe and look at the complete opposite model for development, which you call the order of concrete. And this is rooted in the East Asian idea of the developmental state.
And this is where the contrast becomes just incredibly sharp. The developmental state, or you'll hear it called the hard state, or state-led developmentalism, it operates on a foundational principle that the state's explicit and primary goal is rapid economic development.
So all other policy measures are in service to that one objective.
Exactly. It's a total paradigm shift from the Western regulatory state.
Explain that distinction. A regulatory state is more like a referee.
A referee is a great way to put it. It enforces the rules of the game to prevent market failures, things like pollution or monopolies, and it provides basic public goods. The developmental state, on the other hand, is an active player on the field.
It's the coach, the owner, the general manager.
All of the above. Its characteristics include strong, autonomous state intervention, aggressive strategic planning, and really substantial control over the economy. It doesn't just regulate, it actively promotes new industries and manages economic shifts with a long-term national vision.
So it's industrial policy in action, driven by a centralized bureaucracy instead of a diffuse, consensus-driven process.
Precisely. And you can see the results. Look at the pioneering work done by Japan after World War II.
The Japanese economic miracle.
Right. Scholars attribute that miracle in large part to the far-sighted guiding hand of its bureaucrats, especially within the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITA.
What did MIT actually do?
In essence, the state acted as a national venture capitalist and chief strategist. It mobilized the majority of the nation's capital and strategically directed it into promising industrial sectors, steel, cars, electronics. The goal was always to maximize the spillover effect for the whole society.
To ensure rapid technological growth and dominate export markets.
That was the playbook.
So Japan created the blueprint, but South Korea, they took that and executed it with almost military precision. That transformation is just astounding.
South Korea is probably the ultimate case study in state capacity. After the 1961 military coup, they didn't just hope for the best from decentralized market forces.
No.
They created powerful central organizations, the Economic Planning Board, and the Ministry of Trade and Industry. These weren't advisory bodies. They were designed specifically to control and manipulate the market system to achieve targeted, export-oriented growth.
And a key mechanism here, which sounds so counterintuitive to Western economics, was the concept of deliberately getting relative prices wrong. What does that even mean?
It is the complete antithesis of the laissez-faire model. Getting prices wrong means the state actively manipulated exchange rates, controlled wages for certain industries, and offered highly targeted conditional subsidies.
So, for example, if they wanted to build up their shipbuilding industry,
they could ensure that steel was available to the shipbuilders at a below-market cost. They could make sure borrowing rates were artificially low. They were effectively subsidizing exports by distorting the domestic market.
So the state is shielding these strategic industries from market forces until they're strong enough to compete on the global stage.
Exactly. They started with light industry, textiles, and so on, then pivoted aggressively toward heavy and chemical industries, steel, shipbuilding, automaking. This direct state involvement is what created the massive export conglomerates, the K-balls, that are global giants today.
And the results, I mean, the numbers speak for themselves.
They really do. South Korea's GDP per capita just exploded. It went from about $876 in 1950 to over $22,000 by 2010. That is rapid, material, world-altering development.
A velocity of change that, you're right, the West seems to have completely lost. And we see a similar, though maybe more tailored approach in Singapore.
Singapore is a fascinating case. Lacking any natural resources, they focused their developmental state efforts on human capital. They engineered their labor force.
They couldn't compete on raw materials, so they decided to compete on people.
And planning. They transformed from a basic manufacturing hub to a highly planned global city. The government used systems like the Vocational and Industrial Training Board to match workers' skills precisely to projected market demands. They were building a labor supply for the economy they wanted to have in 10 years.
Moving deliberately toward high-value sectors like finance and biotech.
It's an engine designed for sustained, targeted economic doubling. And the consequence, as we see across the entire region, is this dramatic reduction in poverty.
Yeah, the material improvement is just undeniable.
In a place like Indonesia, despite a huge population increase, the poverty rate fell from 60% in 1970 down to 12% by 1996. These nations were doubling their economies in 10-year stretches.
A rate that took the industrialized West, like England during its revolution, decades longer to achieve.
The developmental state proves its efficacy not in reports and consultations, but in the tangible uplift of millions of lives.
And this success brings us right back to infrastructure, to the order of concrete. Let's look at how this different philosophy translates into the actual physical reality of building a high-speed rail line. This is where the story of Budi, the textile vendor, is so important.
Yes, Budi's story provides the perfect human anchor for this abstract comparison. We have to understand his perspective to really grasp why the order of concrete has such immense political gravity.
So for 20 years, Budi's business in Bandung, Indonesia, was basically strangled by a brutal 3-hour commute into Jakarta.
He was living in a world influenced by the Vetocracy, where Western consultants came, held years of town halls, talked about procedural justice, and generated endless reports.
But the road stayed cracked. The gridlock only got worse. To him, the Western model felt like paralysis disguised as polite deliberation. It was a democratic process that guaranteed his life would never materially improve.
And that is the crucial realization for so many developing nations. Endless deliberation isn't noble, it's a fatal luxury. Time is the most valuable, non-renewable resource.
And every year spent litigating a power line is a year of lost economic opportunity for millions of people like Budi.
Then the East Asian model arrived. The Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail project moved with the physical weight of sustained state will. They didn't have 10 years of environmental reviews. They had a mandate and a construction schedule.
And Budi's grueling 3-hour crawl became a 40-minute high-speed glide.
And that transformation defines the principle of efficiency as justice. For Budi, the ultimate human right isn't a guaranteed seat at an endless governance workshop. It's the right to development, the right to a functional economy delivered now.
The train line isn't just transportation. It's physical proof that the state can successfully project its will onto the geography for the betterment of its people.
It also showcases the power of what's called intergenerational relay in the East Asian bureaucratic engine. These complex, decade-long projects are treated as sustained, phased national missions.
They're insulated from the chaotic political battles and election cycles that constantly derail Western infrastructure projects.
When the state acts as the prime mover, not just a hesitant referee, it can fundamentally alter the landscape. Budi's life, pivoting from cracked roads to a high-speed glide, is a testament to a civilization's efficacy. It shows they can still shape their own future.
Which leads us directly to the structural reason the West has lost this capacity. It's not just legal paralysis, it's a kind of financial atrophy. We have to dissect the financial and intellectual core of the problem, the triumph of financialization over the real economy.
This section is absolutely critical because the decline in the West's ability to build is rooted in a fundamental divergence in how its capitalism now operates versus its historical ideal.
Yeah.
We have to distinguish between industrial capitalism and finance capitalism.
Okay, let's start with the ideal. What was industrial capitalism trying to do?
Its primary focus was simple. MCM, you invest money in commodities factories, machinery, labor to produce more money through the sale of tangible goods and services. It was all about production.
And crucially, you mentioned it sought to clear away feudal rent-seeking. What does that mean?
It meant that industrialists saw things like land rent from landlords or usurious interest from bankers as a drag on the productive economy. They wanted to minimize all unnecessary costs of production.
These faux frays, the false costs. What were they trying to eliminate to make industry more competitive?
The big ones were land rent, monopoly pricing from essential services, and excessive financial overhead. Industrialists believed the state should provide infrastructure, roads, education, water at zero or minimal cost.
Because it lowered the cost of production for everyone.
Exactly. It made the whole economy more competitive globally. The focus was on productive reinvestment, not extraction.
But the modern model, finance capitalism, just flips this logic on its head.
It's the complete antithesis. Finance capitalism seeks wealth primarily through the extraction of economic rent. It operates on the logic of MMS, making money purely from money and credit, disconnected from producing anything tangible.
So it's more profitable to own the asset and charge a fee or interest than it is to invest in building a new factory.
Far more profitable. And the engine for this extraction is the dominance of the FIRE sector: finance, insurance, and real estate.
The FIRE sector has basically engineered the modern economic architecture to favor itself, creating these, what do you call them, neo-rentier economies.
That's right. And you see it in where the talent goes. The best engineering minds aren't designing better trains anymore. They're going into financial engineering, designing complex debt structures to maximize short-term returns.
And the numbers that detail this shift in corporate priorities are just staggering. U.S. corporate income is being funneled directly away from productive investment.
Just look at how major U.S. corporations use their income. Over 90% of recent corporate income is earmarked for raising stock prices.
Through stock buybacks and dividends.
Primarily. And often they're borrowing money to fund these buybacks, which artificially inflates their earnings per share, but also increases their debt-to-equity ratios.
So they're maximizing shareholder value in the short term, but they are fundamentally cannibalizing their own long-term industrial capacity. That money isn't going into R&D or new machinery.
Not at all. It's a totally unsustainable focus on capital gains over genuine productive profit. And the single largest engine for this rentier resurgence is real estate.
Explain that. How does real estate become this financial engine instead of just, a place to live?
Real estate is the largest asset category, and residential mortgages account for something like 80% of all bank credit in the US and Britain. The process is all about debt leveraging.
So as asset prices, land prices go up.
They go up not because the land is producing more, but because banks are willing to lend more money against that land.
So the price of a starter home in a city isn't determined by its construction cost. It's determined by the maximum amount of debt a buyer can possibly service over 30 years.
That's it, exactly. When buyers bid against each other, the price is set by the winner, who is willing to pay the full economic rent of that location, which is paid to the bank as interest on a massive mortgage. The financial sector captures all the rising surpluses.
And this cycle leads directly to something called debt deflation, which is a huge headwind for the real economy.
Debt deflation is the tightening noose of financial overhead. A rising share of both personal and corporate income gets absorbed by debt service, mortgage payments, car loans, student loans.
Which leaves less and less money to be spent on actual goods and services.
Right. And that leads to slowing economic growth and austerity for the average family, even as asset owners see their portfolios appreciate.
It's the industrial economy starving to feed the financial overhead. This has to lead to the privatization of public goods, which ties right back to our infrastructure conversation.
It's the logical conclusion. Historically, industrial advantage was built on the state providing infrastructure and education at the lowest possible cost as a public utility to stay competitive.
But finance capitalism sees these natural monopolies not as public goods,
but as untapped rent opportunities.
So the agenda is to privatize these systems: healthcare, toll roads, utilities, so you can extract monopoly rents from them, which raises the cost structure of the entire economy.
It's fundamentally self-defeating for a nation's long-term health. Think about healthcare or education in the U.S. When you financialize these basic services, workers and employers have to shoulder these massive costs for private insurance or crippling student debt. That adds a huge cost premium to every single product made and every service rendered in the country.
Meanwhile, the non-financialized competitors, like the developmental states in East Asia, are supplying these things freely or at a very low cost as a public utility. Their labor force is just cheaper to maintain.
It's a critical competitive advantage. America's deindustrialization is, in many ways, a direct consequence of this, of debt leveraging and financializing its core infrastructure. The nation's energy is siphoned into legal rent-seeking and the financial sector, away from building and making.
And the capacity to physically alter the world. It just atrophies because the profits are somewhere else now.
Exactly.
That atrophy now defines this geopolitical pivot. If the West's primary export has become financial speculation and governance reports, what are nations in, say, Southeast Asia choosing instead?
They're making a very clear-eyed, rational calculation. They are weighing what we could call democratic dogma against prosperous utility. It's a fundamental strategic shift.
Let's define that dogma. What was their experience with Western aid and partnership over the last few decades?
The experience was that Western assistance often came bundled with immense governance overhead and explicit political conditionalities. Aid wasn't just money for a road.
Right.
It was often money for reports, for NGOs, for endless consultations on institutional reform, which were frequently tied to the donor country's own internal political priorities. It was incredibly process-heavy and often stalled projects entirely.
So the West was exporting a narrative of good governance, but the tangible purchasing power of that narrative, in terms of actual finished bridges and power plants, just plummeted.
You could say the West's narrative capability suffered catastrophic inflation. Southeast Asian nations realized they were getting endless reports on how to run a better government, but their kids were still stuck in crippling traffic jams.
They got tired of aid that prioritized political conditions over the physical delivery of infrastructure.
That's where the East Asian model stepped in, offering a completely different bargain. And the story of Somsak, the engineer, really encapsulates this frustration.
He spent the first half of his career buried under these conditionality reports for Western-funded projects.
And those projects were often structurally fragile. They might collapse if the political cycle shifted thousands of miles away in Washington or Brussels, or if a new report demanded a complete overhaul. He realized he was spending his life building a political narrative, not a real economy.
So the East Asian approach came in and replaced the financialization of aid with the simple delivery of steel and concrete.
And he said the change in atmosphere was instant. There were no multi-year lectures on institutional reform. There was a blueprint, there was financing, and there was a deadline.
The East Asian model offers a true realist's bargain. Partnership based on mutual material gain, non-interference in domestic politics, and a laser focus on physical output.
And for many of these nations, that's seen as the most direct route to achieving tangible economic sovereignty.
It really is the ultimate stress test. If the Western democratic model leads to institutional decay and paralysis, and the East Asian model delivers high-speed connectivity now, well, the choice for a developing nation becomes pretty clear.
And that choice isn't just about money, it's about the export of an entire system of governance, a system founded on efficiency, order, and state capacity. Infrastructure becomes governance made manifest.
Take the China-Laos Railway. That project is so much more than just a transport line. It's a physical, undeniable statement about the power of state capacity.
It fundamentally propagates a new narrative. It physically transforms a historically landlocked nation like Laos into a land-linked hub.
That provides immediate, tangible economic integration and trade routes that no amount of values-based lectures or financial reports could ever offer. It recenters the material world as the source of geopolitical power.
This also gets to the atrophy of talent we were talking about. In the West, the most ambitious, mathematically gifted minds are siphoned towards speculative finance and the legal fields that feed the rentier economy.
Litigating, structuring deals, maximizing rent extraction.
The East, conversely, is heavily focused on STEM, on massive project management, on industrial engineering. That focus represents a recentering on the material world of making and building. This engineering capacity is the true backbone of a potent civilization.
And we have the perspective of Lynn, a young tech graduate in one of these rapidly modernizing hubs. She really helps us understand the internal cultural shift.
Lynn grew up admiring the Western narrative, soft power, financial success. But her lived reality is defined by the high-speed blur outside the window of a brand new, punctual regional rail line.
So for her generation, the West's procedural paralysis looks less like a feature of democracy and more like a definitive bug, a sign of decline.
And the East's efficiency and demonstrable state capacity become the new benchmarks of efficacy. She doesn't see a debt trap. She sees tangible, immediate improvements in her life. Punctual service, modern systems, economic opportunity.
The environment itself becomes a symbol of order and predictability.
Absolutely. Modern, gleaming train stations and reliable, punctual service are physical symbols of a functioning social order. They foster discipline and collective trust. When infrastructure works flawlessly, it demonstrates that the system of governance is stable, competent, and forward-looking. That physical reality holds immense sway.
This finally brings us back to the highest level of analysis, where academics are now framing this entire conflict as a systemic choice between two completely different global economic logics.
Right. Reports from institutions like Renmin University of China are now directly challenging the Western consensus. Their argument is very clear. Economic over-financialization is not a sign of modern sophistication. It's a recurring historical marker for the beginning of great power decline.
They're looking back at historical precedent, at empires that shifted their focus from productive industry to rent extraction and financial maneuvering.
And their conclusion is that the organization of real economic activity, the capacity to make things, build things, and deliver goods efficiently, that is the clearest, most sustained indicator of long-term power. Far more important than the size of a country's banking sector.
So the rise of East Asia, driven by this developmental state model, is providing a production-oriented, anti-rent-seeking alternative to the entire global system.
It perfectly reflects the original mission of that model. Mobilizing the nation's capital into promising, productive industrial sectors to generate the maximum spillover effects for the whole society. It ensures the economy serves the national interests of tangible development, not the narrow short-term interests of a financial elite. So when you boil it all down, what we are witnessing is not just a clash of political systems, it's a battle between two economic logics for global supremacy. The Western Vetocracy, driven by process and financial returns, inherently diffuses power into a million veto points. It ensures the collective will is perpetually stalled by individual opposition. This structure just fundamentally hinders the capacity to build anything transformative.
And the order of concrete, on the other hand, prioritizes state capacity, long-term planning, and physical output. That allows for these sustained national endeavors that reshape geography and deliver immediate material benefits. The crumbling bridges and stagnant projects of the West are, unfortunately, the physical manifestation of a system where all the energy is expended on maintaining the form of governance, the endless debate, rather than achieving tangible outcomes. The 21st century is being paved, tunneled, and bridged by the relentless ordered force of East Asian concrete, confirming that capacity, the capacity to make and build, is the ultimate currency of civilization.